Σαν τα μόρες, σαν τα Hello.
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 Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Am I speaking? It is Gregory Kontos this time.
I am Gregory Kontos.
Kontos. Okay. Right. Very glad to meet you.
I'm very glad to meet you too. So I think we have like 4 more minutes to start this session.
Yeah.
So please, be patient for just a couple of minutes and we'll start.
That's absolutely fine. I mean, we're not live at the moment. Is that right?
We are.
We are live.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Right. Is my screen okay as you were seeing it? Is there anything you'd like me to adjust?
It's perfect.
It's perfect. Okay.
Yep.
Right. Well, as I say, I'm at your disposal. But if everyone's listening, we can't really chat in an ordinary kind of way.
Yeah.
Oh, and the other thing, can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Not too loud, not too soft?
It's okay. It's good. No worries.
Okay. Right. Well, I'm ready when you are. So we just get those few minutes.
So since this is a bit uncomfortable, let's just start. Let me just do the introduction and yeah. So yes, everyone, I'm Gregory Kontos of Greek Ancestry, and I'd like to welcome you all to day 2 of the International Greek Ancestry Conference, sponsored by Greek Ancestry and the Hellenic Genealogy Geek. In yesterday's sessions, we covered archival repositories and records, as well as village history projects. The sessions have been recorded and are available on Greek Ancestry's YouTube channel. Today, we're starting with a special session on the 1821 revolution against the Ottomans, the Greek War of Independence, with Professor Roderick Beaton, followed by an interview with Giannis Michalakakos about 19th century village life. Today's third session will be about migration, featuring Professor Alexander Kitroeff and Professor Gonda van Steen and me. Let me introduce our first guest, Roderick Beaton. He grew up in Edinburgh and studied English literature at Peterhouse, Cambridge, before returning to modern Greek as the subject of his doctorate, also at Cambridge. After a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Birmingham, he embarked on a long career at King's College London, first as lecturer in modern Greek language and literature, later as Korais, professor of modern Greek and Byzantine history, language and literature, and since then as emeritus. From 2012 to 2018, he also served as director of the Center for Hellenic Studies at King's. Roderick is the author of many books and articles about aspects of the Greek-speaking world from the 12th century to the present day, including an introduction to modern Greek literature, George Seferis' Waiting for the Angel, a biography, Byron's War, Romantic Rebellion, Greek Revolution, all 3 of which won the prestigious Runciman Award for Best Book on the Hellenic World, and Greece, Biography of a Modern Nation. His latest book, an overview of Greek history from the Bronze Age to the 200th anniversary of the Greek Revolution 2021, is expected to be published in fall 2021 with the title The Greeks, A Global History. So, welcome, Professor. I'm more than honored to be given the opportunity to interview you today. Thank you very, very much for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you for those kind words of introduction. Hello, Gregory, glad to meet you. And hello, everyone who's listening. That's a very generous introduction you gave me. I appreciate it. And I hope to live up to your kind words in the next few little while. So fire away.
When we decided we want to host a session about the revolution and started thinking about the things we would like to know, we realized that this revolution has acquired legendary and mythical dimensions. We know about all the heroes, but nothing about ordinary people, the people who fought, those who sacrificed their lives, the people who stayed behind to take care of their families. So it seems we have a linear and sometimes reductive understanding of the revolution. We do not realize its complexity, its heterogeneities. We do not realize that it was not obvious at all that the revolution would eventually have a successful outcome. So today we would like to learn more about this revolution, what it was like and what it meant for our ancestors and their families. And we would like you to set the stage for this discussion by describing the contemporary Greek world. What was the identity of the Greek people? Was national identity developed and spread enough? How diverse was the population?
Sure. Well, I mean, it wasn't, I mean, you know, what we now call national identity was really kind of in its infancy in those days. It was a developing way of thinking, and the creation of the Greek nation state was actually part of that whole European process. But I mean, I think perhaps the first thing to say is that, you know, before 1821, the Greek world, or as I like to gloss it in English, the Greek speaking world, which is my equivalent of the Greek term Hellenismos, but the Greek speaking world, it stretched and it was kind of scattered all the way from the Ionian Islands off the west coast of Greece in the west, right across the Balkans to the north and the Aegean Sea and Crete to the south, as far as Cyprus in one direction and as far as Pontus and Trebizond in the other. One of the largest Greek centers of population anywhere was the capital of the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople. So there were Greek, you know, there was a Greek Orthodox population widely dispersed right across all these areas. Except in the Ionian Islands, they were all under Ottoman rule. There were also, by that time, quite large Greek communities of people who had moved to southern Russia, what is today Ukraine, Crimea, and the Black Sea coast of modern Russia. They'd been invited there by Catherine the Great, and they went in large numbers, and many of them became, you know, they spoke Russian fluently, they became closely, many of them rose to high positions in the Russian Empire. Someone who we'll very probably mention later, Giannis Kapodistrias, the first governor of independent Greece, actually was a Greek who had done so well in the Imperial Russian civil service that for several years he was foreign minister of Russia. So there's a substantial, sizable Greek population integrated into the Russian Empire. And to complicate matters further, and again with an important part in this story, there's a whole scattering of quite small but very close-knit Greek Orthodox merchant families who'd gone abroad to establish, basically to make money, to build careers in cities all over Western Europe, from, I mean, beginning in Venice and Vienna, which were kind of closest to the Greek-speaking world, but by 1800, they reached as far as London and Amsterdam and Paris. And it wouldn't be long, in fact, I think even before that, the first Greeks were beginning to cross the Atlantic to the United States. In fact, there was a famous Greek who was already in the Argentine Navy, apparently, in the Argentinian War of Independence about the same time. So it's not a short, I'm sorry, it's not a short answer, but it's not a simple question either. You know, who are the Greeks and where are they? They're already in quite a lot of different places.
So in what later became the independent Greek state, the population, were they all Greek speaking? Were they all Orthodox?
Well, I mean, you know, they were all subject to the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire had many different languages. It accepted and tolerated many different, or several different religious faiths. So it was actually quite a cosmopolitan kind of place. It was polyglot. I mean, nowadays there's a slight tendency among, you know, people in terms of late 20th century multiculturalism to kind of idealize the Ottoman Empire and say, well, you know, it was tolerant, it was inclusive. It wasn't very tolerant. It did include, but not in a very modern or necessarily very amicable kind of way. But the result of the way the Ottomans organized their empire was basically a kind of, you know, it's a kind of pyramid structure. You got the Sultan at the very top. It was theocratic. It was Islamic. The upper classes were all Muslim, and those who were non-Muslims were subject to discriminatory taxes and could be treated in various unpleasant ways. in particular circumstances. In that world, the area that we call Greece had no sort of distinctive identity at all. And the population, the makeup of the population, so far as we can tell, we don't always know in that much detail, but certainly in the Peloponnese and probably all the islands of the Aegean and Crete, the great majority spoke Greek. In most of these places, the great majority also were Orthodox, and really the Orthodox religion is, I think, is the key to understanding those whom nowadays we call Greeks at this time. What they have in common is the Orthodox religion and the worship in the language of the New Testament, the original language of Christianity, and whatever language they speak at home, which is not always Greek. If they are educated, or if they're merchants who are keeping records and so on, they're all doing that in Greek. So a lot of the heroes of the revolution, particularly the ones who came from the islands of Hydra and Spetses, their first language was a dialect of Albanian called Arvanitika in Greek, but it's a dialect of Albanian. It's not Greek at all. And elsewhere, people were Vlachi, they were Valachians. Another great political leader, Ioannis Koletis, who came from Ioannina, came from a Vlach-speaking family. So his first language would have been a dialect of today's Romanian. I think one thing that is true to say is that at least in the southern part of Greece and in the islands, there were very few of those who we would like nowadays probably call ethnic Turks. There was never really much attempt by the Ottomans at colonizing those places. Even in Crete, where there were a lot of Muslims, unusually in the Ottoman Empire, Cretan Muslims all spoke Greek, not Turkish. And the other thing is that, just about everybody, even quite humble people, would have been used to doing daily business in different languages. You use one language for the priest, another if you have to go to the Ottoman authorities, and you might use a third at home. If you're doing business, you might be doing business with people speaking 3 or 4 different languages. So you've got that. It's really quite mixed. But certainly in the southern part of today's Greece and the islands, I think there's no doubt that Greek speakers are in the majority, and the majority of them certainly are Orthodox Christians. As you go further north, it gets a bit more complicated. Thessaly and Macedonia, Epirus, populations are far more mixed, and the Christian in those areas, the Christian populations have a sense of being, they call themselves Romi or Rum in Turkish. It was Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, that united them, and the different ethnicities that would later emerge in the Balkans. Really, that's something that developed in the 19th century. It's not very strong before 1821. So it's as well to think of, the lands that would become modern Greece as sort of ethnically and linguistically and in religious terms, a bit of a patchwork out of which the ethnicity that we know today emerged. And the key fact that made that happen, of course, was the revolution of 1821.
So the religion, orthodoxy, was what united Greek-speaking populations, but also others, Albanian-speaking, Black-speaking. But it was also what distinguished them from the Muslims. And this distinction, it was what caused this systemic unfairness. But this was something that was going on for centuries, right? Since the Ottomans firstly occupied the country.
Exactly. Why did it not happen for almost 400 years?
So exactly, what was the spark? What was we could call the main cause of the revolution? Was it that suddenly national identity became, a priority, or were there other factors involved?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of factors involved, and as always with historical causation, it's a sort of classic university history essay. What were the causes of? And you could go on and on. Let me hazard this one. Think of 1776 and the United States Declaration of Independence, the rights of man, and the idea of liberty. That had never really emerged as a political concept in that way before. The same idea, and very much the same intellectual underpinnings in the European Enlightenment, took violent political form once again in 1789 at the beginning of the French Revolution. So, as we all know in hindsight, the American Revolution succeeded, and there you are. Bless you all. The French Revolution, I'm always a little nervous with my French friends and colleagues saying this, but it can't be counted as an entire success, though of course it did lay the basis for much of modern France and much of modern Europe. But the French Revolution led to the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon was defeated. So that the idea of liberty, equality, fraternity in Europe was very thoroughly quashed at the end of those wars in 1815. But just because Napoleon didn't, well, what was Napoleon trying to do by that time? But anyway, the French Revolution didn't lead to a new, lasting political creation as the American one did. But they were both founded on the same principles. And I think to boil it down to essentials, it is a single word of liberty. And right across Europe, whatever side people were on, whether they loved the French or were occupied by them and came to hate them, lots of people were fired up by this idea of liberty. And tied to that is the idea of self-determination. I mean, that again is in the American Declaration of Independence. It is the people, in some way, not specified, who really determine their own fate, their own destiny, their own future. And that idea, lit a long fuse that ran right through, first of all, through the Americas. Don't forget, the North America was followed by the South American wars of independence against Spanish and Portuguese rule. But that long fuse ran right across Europe as well. And after 1815 and after the defeat of Napoleon, there were lots of people who'd been who were old enough to have been inspired by the French Revolution, perhaps horrified at what it led to, but also nostalgic for these hopes, these ideals that had been unleashed. So you couldn't put that idea of liberty back in its box. And all over Europe, there were lots of people talking about liberty, writing about liberty, wherever they were allowed to. And in many places they weren't. And because they weren't, a lot of them also formed secret societies and they plotted in the dark. And between around about 1820, 1821, there were about 4 or 5 revolutions in different parts of Europe, in Spain, in southern Italy, in northern Italy, in Piedmont. There was one planned in northern Italy that didn't happen. None of those lasted for any time at all. But that sort of mentality, that ferment for freedom was around in Europe. And the one corner of Europe where I think nobody would have expected it to happen was actually not in Christian-ruled Europe at all, but among the Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire. And 1821, the Greek Revolution was about the 4th or 5th in a series of revolutions sparked by a revolutionary secret society inspired by the ideas of the French and American revolutions. Unlike all the others, the Greek one worked. And it's another question, why?
Right. So we're talking about a religious community that is looking for self-determination and liberation, right? So, I mean,
yeah,
it is not so much, is it so much about civil rights and national liberation, or is it more about religious a more, let's say, uniform, the creation of a uniform religious community territory.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and this is where the position gets complicated, because the people who are most directly and most directly intellectually inspired by the revolutions in the Americas and in France are the educated Greeks, the intellectuals. And these are the ones who are fully plugged into intellectual currents and ideas in Europe. And this is, at the time, this is a minority of Greeks for whom the gold standard and the new standard for their own identity is one that their European contemporaries are themselves holding up as an example, namely ancient Greece, the Hellenes of old. So among the intellectuals, the cry for freedom, if you like, is understood as self-determination, as you say, sort of civic responsibilities, and it naturally becomes linked to the heritage that comes with the language of ancient Greek civilization. So these are the people who are still a minority at the time, who around about 1800 really begin quite consciously and deliberately to revive the term Hellenes to describe themselves, whereas up until that time, Hellenes in Greek were nearly always reserved for the ancient Greeks, whereas contemporary Greeks call themselves Romii, which literally means Romans. But on the ground, the majority who are fighting for you're absolutely right, it's for their religious identity and their freedom as Orthodox Christians. They too have clearly taken on board in their own varying ways the single concept of freedom, of liberty. And that in turn leads to, well, it must be one of the reasons that the revolution is succeeding, but it also leads to one of the reasons that the revolution came close to not succeeding, which was that once the Greeks had begun to win their freedom in 1823 and 1824, in the very middle of their struggle for independence, they actually fell out very badly among themselves, because different groups and different individuals had deeply clashing ideas of what this single concept of liberty meant. I tend not to think of it in terms of secularists against sort of the Orthodox religion, because there's not really much of a secularist sort of movement at all in Greece. There's no anti-clericalism, for example, at all, as there was in the European Enlightenment. But there are those for whom the Hellenic heritage kind of comes first, and for them, the new republican ideas of the Enlightenment are what matter most. And there are those for whom liberty is a more kind of local, immediate affair. So it's Orthodox Christians simply fighting for the freedom to run their own mountains and valleys or island in their own way. So those factions they're sometimes called modernists, or the kind of outward-looking sort of state-building architects of the Greek state as it later developed, and the who then clashed with those whom historians now call the warlords, the people who actually did the fighting on the ground, but weren't frankly very interested in political theory at all. I think it's doing no disservice to the memory of famous names in Greek history to say that, someone like Theodoros Kolokotronis or Odysseus Androutsos would, the real goal for these people was to, was to be boss, was to be top dog, to be able to nakanu commando, as you say in Greek, to be able to tell people what to do. They just weren't, they weren't educated in a way that would make them interested in political theory. It was practical politics, and let's be honest, it was pretty rough and pretty brutal, because that's the way life was in those days.
Right. So we have different groups different power groups, we have different priorities. Would you say that the mass, the ordinary people, they were more willing to to go to fight under the flag of religion? So that was their main motivation?
Oh yeah, I think it was. But again, if you remember, I mean, the famous, the banner and the slogan was always Ελευθερία ή Θάνατος, liberty or death. And you could that would encapsulate a lot of different priorities or ideologies. And, that was one that everyone could subscribe to. But yes, I think for the great majority of the rank and file, it was a religious war. And I mean, you can see that also in some of the terrible stories, because Christians massacred Muslims, Muslims massacred Christians, and sadly, tragically, the Jewish communities got massacred too, because they weren't Orthodox. They spoke Greek, but it wasn't enough. It really meant orthodoxy or death. But the political organization was built along the lines of the American and French Revolution, so that right from the beginning there was a National Assembly, there was a provisional constitution, there were 3 such assemblies, or 3 and a half. There was a 4th that didn't really last very long, and there were several provisional constitutions. I mean, to digress, one of the ironies about the Greek War of Independence, revolution, it was a time of complete anarchy, but during those 10 years, there was, at least in theory, there was a constitution was in force and had been voted on according to quite advanced, theoretical political principles. On the other hand, for the first 10 years, after order had been restored and Greece became a proper nation state with a proper, in inverted commas, monarch to rule it, there was no constitution at all. One of the things that civilizing Europe did to Greece was actually deprive it of the constitution that the Greeks had created for themselves. That was only for 10 years. From 1844, as you know, of course, there was a constitution, and a very advanced one.
Right. Interesting. So who fights in the revolution? Who does this revolutionary army consist of? Are there like all the males? How is the army? How do soldiers come together? How is the army?
Yeah, it's worse than that, Gregory. There is no army. Everybody fights, and you have no choice. Because once the first shot is fired, the Ottoman reprisals were so indiscriminate and so disproportionate that anyone who's involved in revolution anywhere, once it starts, you've just got to take up arms and kill anyone who comes after you, because if you don't, they're going to kill you. The victories were not won by regular soldiers; they were run by guerrilla groups. It was very like. The partisans in the Second World War modeled themselves very much on these guerrilla groups. But it was it was all irregular warfare. Every time the provisional government and every time the Philhellenes, those brave volunteers from Europe and America who went to help, every time they tried to organize a regular army and drill soldiers and get everybody standing in line obeying orders, it was a complete flop. And the first regular army in independent Greece got wiped out at the Battle of Petta in 1822. At the very same time, within about a couple of weeks of it, when Theodoros Kolokotronis led a band of his irregulars and trapped a huge organized Ottoman army between Nafplon and Corinth at the Battle of Dervenakia, and they just massacred them. But it was guerrilla tactics that worked, but there wasn't really, there was very little what we would call military discipline. There wasn't much organization either. It was or coordination. it was groups led by charismatic leaders who sometimes just kind of went on the rampage, and they killed the Muslims, but they knew that if they didn't, the Muslims were going to kill them. So yes, so the short answer is everybody is fighting, everybody who can, and I mean there are stories of there are famous stories of women taking up arms as well. There's Bubulina in Idra who owned and I think captained her own ship. Mando Mavroyanus in the islands, but I think at a lower level too. I mean, everybody who could wield a musket or a gra, they called it, the old-fashioned muskets. Everybody could, or even just a dagger or a sword. They they pick it up and they defend themselves. And if the opportunity arose, again, sometimes pretty horrifically, they'd fall upon the other side and kill them. Nobody, I don't think anybody. There was no room for conscientious objectors, put it that way.
Right. So like we have a society which is pushed to war, yeah, to some extent pushed. Yeah. Okay, so away from the battlefield, what happens in the villages? What happens? How does the revolution impact ordinary families?
Well, again, it depends where you are. I mean, in the Peloponnese and the southern half of mainland Greece, it really, I mean, it really goes back to what I was saying before. I mean, everybody was involved, and there was no real escape from that. Men, if you're a man, it's kill or be killed. Women, we were talking about before. I mean, I think it's one aspect of this that it's well worth reminding ourselves of, that the Ottomans had a very sophisticated slave market, and it was routine for women and children who were captured in war to be taken to the slave market and sold. And this happened to tens of thousands of, I was going to say Greek women, but I mean actually almost any Christian women, any women who were on the wrong side, who were caught up in these violent events. And I mean even in some parts of the Greek-speaking, some Greeks did try to stay out of it. The famous example is the island of Chios, which it suffered a particularly tragic fate. But one of the ironies of that fate is that, Chios was a rich island because it was where the mastic trees grew, and the farmers and the merchants of Chios were Greek, grew very rich on having almost a monopoly of this luxury product that kept the ladies of the Sultan's harem in Constantinople in chewing gum. So they wanted nothing to do with the revolution because it was going to ruin their market. What happened? A bunch of much more aggressive Greeks from a much more aggressive island, Samos, not far away to the south, landed on the shore of Chios, ran amok, started killing the Muslim authorities, and there was nothing the Chiots could do. And it was a classic case again of this extraordinarily violent and extraordinarily disproportionate system of Ottoman reprisal. The majority of Chiot males were massacred. The majority of Chiot women were sold into slavery, although the actual aggressors had not come from Chios at all. So that is a kind of salutary tale. But the massacre of Chios, as I'm sure you know, is one of the sort of horror stories of the Greek War of Independence. It's also one that sent shockwaves around the whole of Europe. It inspired the famous painting by Delacroix. And again, I think it's another example of something I was saying before, that one of the things that helped, but one that fueled the success of the revolution was the sheer horror of the Ottoman reprisals, which was so extreme as to provoke not just the victims, but actually people all over the world to look on in horror and think, surely, we can't allow this. It's sometimes said, I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's sometimes said that what we now call humanitarian interventionism really began during the Greek Revolution. I'm not sure that's quite true, but the instincts that led to it, I think, did. And even some notorious politicians in the West who were dead against any revolution, and certainly against the Greek one, were equally horrified by Chios and began to sit up and say, actually, can European governments sit back and let this kind of thing happen? Which is one of the ways in which Europe becomes involved in the Greek Revolution, which we haven't talked about, but perhaps that may be for another time.
Yep. So in a way, Ottoman reprisals generate support to the Greek cause, and they extend, could we say, like they expanded the extent to which all of Greece became engaged in the revolution. So, I mean, Samos does something, Chios pays for it. So automatically you have two areas involved.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of dynamic is going on all over the Greek-speaking world. And again, I mean, the focus is on those areas of, actually a rather small area of the geographically dispersed Greek-speaking world I was talking about at the beginning. Because really all the action is concentrated on the Peloponnese, southern Roumeli, and the Aegean. There are other places where Greeks rebelled, in Macedonia, in the the northern Aegean coast, and in Asia Minor, in the Asia Minor coast, and of course in the what is now Romania, the Danubian principalities. That was an important theatre of war right at the beginning. But in all those places, the revolution was stamped out, again with horrific and exemplary brutality. But in those cases, the brutality worked. Another case, tragic in a different way, was Cyprus, where actually there was no revolution, but the Orthodox Archbishop and Ethnarch was beheaded anyway, and the higher clergy were hanged. It was a kind of reprisal before the event, just as a kind of warning. So it was, it was kind of, in 1821 at the beginning, it must have been a knife edge. I mean, in about half the Greek-speaking world, it was brutally and totally repressed. The same is true in Constantinople, where hundreds of very well-to-do, very eminent Greeks were either publicly beheaded or hanged, including the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church, of course. But in those areas where, once they got through the first weeks and months, and that's the Peloponnese, southern mainland, and the Aegean, by that time there's no going back, because you knew that if you gave up, you were done for. And that was one thing, I think, that strengthened the resolve of the Greeks who had got through that initial stage. But it is worth remembering that the area where the revolution succeeded was relatively small. And that in turn is why the geographical extent of the Greek state, when it first had recognized boundaries in 1832, was very much smaller even than today's Greece. There's only about a third of today's Greece, but a much smaller fraction of the more widely dispersed Greek-speaking world before 1821.
So we have a situation where, whether you like it or not, you have to engage in the revolution. But Europeans and the rest of the world, they could choose to what extent they wanted to intervene. So what was this intervention and what steered it? And after the revolution, proved to be successful. How did that influence world history?
Yeah, I mean, I like the distinction you make there, Gregory. That yes, the Greeks don't have a choice. They're kind of they're up in they're in arms, and they're engaged already. It's quite a nice way of putting it. The Europeans have a choice. I mean, they're looking on, they're looking in from outside, the answer is that, to begin with, very small numbers of individuals become passionately involved from the outside. A handful of them, about 1,000 probably altogether, were prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice, and a lot of those did make the ultimate sacrifice. They actually went to Greece, took up arms. Lord Byron is the most famous of all of those, but there were more, about 1,000, perhaps slightly more, who actually risked their lives and often lost their lives actually joining in the battle. And these are called the Philhellenes, the lovers of Greeks or of things Greek. And they were what I think of as the kind of wedge in the door that kind of prized open what was originally a very local and specific struggle in Greece to becoming an international affair. The fact that foreigners were there began to prize it open, but there were also a lot more Philhellenes who I think rather unfairly called armchair Philhellenes. But these were people back at home in the United States and in every country in Europe who organized committees, raised money, wrote letters to the press, lobbied their members of parliament or equivalent when they had them, pressure groups. And it was enormously effective. So that by 1826, by which time the Ottomans had mounted a pretty devastating counterattack against the Greeks in the Peloponnese, the governments of Europe, against all their own instincts, which would have nothing to do with the revolution, were really forced to, first of all, to take notice, and then to begin to take a hand. So the Philhellenes kind of prized the door open. And by 1826, when there's a serious risk that the Greeks might actually be annihilated, governments in Europe are thinking, well, our own people are involved. They're lobbying us. We can't really sit back and let this happen. And to cut a long story short, the result is that the British, the French, and the Russians basically got together around the table and said, we've kind of got to do something. But the most fascinating dynamic of this is they didn't talk to the Greeks and they didn't talk to the Turks. They talked to each other. And the main objective was to make sure that whoever won, none of the three was going to get an advantage over the other two. So it's the triangle of the British, the French, and the Russians. It's kind of edging round each other, trying to make sure that none gets an advantage out of the Greek Revolution. They sent a task force, a naval task force, to the Aegean. They take on the Ottoman fleet in the Battle of Navarino in October 1827. They annihilate the Ottoman fleet, and from then on, two things: success for the revolution in some form is assured, but also the European powers have taken a hand, and now for them, there's no going back either. So the fate of Greece becomes a European matter to be resolved by the great powers of Europe. The solution they came up with was to recognize Greece as a sovereign independent state, which happened in an international treaty signed in London on the 3rd of February 1830. And that, for me, is the key date after 1821 in the whole story of the Greek Revolution, because that's the first moment when the great powers of Europe they'd already imposed their will on the Ottomans, so the Ottomans couldn't object to this. They declared that they recognized Greece as sovereign and independent. Now, exactly how sovereign, how independent Greece would turn out to be in the future, that of course is another story, perhaps for another Greek ancestry conference.
Right.
But the fact of that recognition is enormously important, because after the American revolutions and after the failed French Revolution, That recognition of Greece as sovereign independent was the first new nation state created on the revolutionary Enlightenment model in the whole of Europe. And all the other nation states of Europe actually followed Greece. Belgium in 1831, Switzerland in 1848, Italy and Germany in 1871, Ireland in 1922, Turkey in 1923, take it right on to the breakup of Yugoslavia and Kosovo in 2008. But extraordinarily, historians of nationalism and of Europe never seem to give Greece its due. I mean, I'm not saying Greeks or Greece invented the nation state. They didn't. It was an Enlightenment idea. It sort of matured during the Romantic period. But it was first tried out by Greeks in Greece. And it was that treaty of 1830 that really empowered them to do that. And at the same time, it marked a key move, a pivotal point from the old Europe of autocratic empires to the Europe that we know and perhaps love or not so much today of nation states.
We have only a few minutes left, but I want to ask one more question, or two maybe. Could you tell us, like, in the eyes of those people in Europe and America who became fond of the Greek cause, was this cause against a despotic or a Muslim regime? And then the states, how did they legitimize their intervention as an intervention, like, again, against a Muslim or a despotic empire?
Well, there are two different things there. I mean, the individual Philhellenes and the Philhellenic movement, I mean, it all fitted rather neatly together for them because the enemy were A, Muslim, B, sort of Asiatic, Oriental, and I'm sure there's a third one. But I mean, there was it was very easy. There was a lot of sort of sloganizing about the barbaric Turks and lumping together the Turks of the 19th century with the Persians of the 1st century BCE. So there was a the kind of easy identification of enlightened brackets query Christian Europe against Oriental despotism, which played into Philhellenic sort of sympathies very well, and most of the Philhellenes, and I suppose this would apply to governments too, found it quite easy to identify with the spirit of ancient Greece and this idea that this was a war to sort of vindicate, liberate, and even revive the civilization that they all admired. When you get the great power diplomacy, it's a lot more hard-headed and a bit more brutal than that, and most of those are pretty autocratic too. So they're not going for the despotism angle at all. It's I think the key there was that they won the Battle of Navarino, and the Russians won a war against the Turks, fought in the Caucasus in 1829, which meant that the Russians could dictate terms to the Ottomans. And then the British and the French had to jump in and say, well, we can't have the Russians becoming top dog, so we really need to listen to what the Greeks have been saying all along, which is, in the game of power politics, you need an independent Greece as a counterweight to Russia. So that's hard-headed, call it cynical if you will, but it's, I'm afraid that's realpolitik.
I wish we had like one more hour to discuss about all this. As you said, maybe a next Greek Ancestry conference or webinar. Again, thank you so much for this. I think it was an interesting discussion. I hope it was interesting for you too.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting. I hope all you people listening found it interesting too.
Thank you, Professor. Be sure we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, Carol, do you have anything cool to announce now?
I actually do. And hello, everybody. I've been really active on the chat today. Those of you that have been watching Professor Beaton, did he not just do an incredible job in explaining the background of how our ancestors could have been affected by the revolution and all the other factors that came into play? I'm going to give a little plug for his book. I put it in the chat. It's called Greece, the Biography of a Modern Nation. And it is just, it's so fascinating to read. So thank you to Professor Beaton. And as Gregory will introduce our next speaker in just a few minutes, in the meantime, Gregory has a giveaway for today. And I'm excited to announce that his giveaway is going to be a discounted coupon for some records on Greek ancestry. So in order to qualify to get this wonderful giveaway prize, what I need you to do is go into the chat and just type in the numbers 1821 in the chat. And I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. And what I'll do is just close my eyes and point to the screen and just pick a name at random. So 1821, just type it in the chat, and I will do this giveaway in just a couple of minutes. In the meantime, I hope that all of you are finding that this is a worthwhile and interesting topic that we have in our conferences. We've got so many more wonderful ones coming up, not only today, but tomorrow, and we'll announce those as well in just a few minutes. So, okay, I see the chat lighting up and I am ready. I'm actually going to take my mouse and I'm going to scroll down the screen so it's not like the first one or two people. And right now I'm going to pick a name, and it is Elias. Wait a second, gotta put my glasses on. Elias Kalesis, K-A-L-E-S-S-I-S. Elias Kalesis has won a discount coupon for records on Greek ancestry. Congratulations, Elias. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I will now turn the time over to Greg for his introduction of our next speaker. Thanks for being with us. Oh, one thing, I'm sorry, I apologize. I was just writing Elias's name down. Elias, you need to reach out to Gregory to claim your prize. So you can do that either through the GreekAncestry.net website. Just click on contact and just tell him you're the winner for the Saturday morning giveaway. Or you can send him an email, greekancestry@outlook.com. So either way, just please be sure to reach out to Greg. Thanks.
Carol, did you already announce a winner?
I did.
Oh, cool.
It's Elias Kalesis, K-A-L-E-S-S-I-S. I've written his name down, and he will be reaching out to you to get his discount coupon. So thanks, Greg. I will turn it over to you, and I will see you again shortly.
Okay, sounds good.
Thanks.
We are going to start the second session for today about 19th century village life with Giannis Michalakakos. Giannis will connect shortly. Καλησπέρα.
Καλησπέρα Grigori. Hello Gregory.
How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. Greetings from Mani Peninsula. Greetings from Greece.
Greetings from Athens to Mani then.
Yes.
Okay, everyone. So we still have a couple of minutes before we start the session. So we'll be starting, we're supposed to start at 1:15, but we can also do it a bit later. We still have a couple of minutes though.
I thought that we started automatically, and for this reason I did all these Tararan.
Okay.
Γρηγόρη, δεν θα σου κρύψω ότι αν και έχω ξανασυμμετάσχει σε τέτοιο είδους meeting, ας πούμε, είναι η πρώτη φορά που αισθάνομαι έτσι άγχος. Δεν ξέρω γιατί. Ίσως επειδή είναι όλο αυτό, ξέρεις, τώρα με τον COVID και πρέπει να ταξιδέψω και αύριο για Κρήτη και δεν θέλω, να σου πω την αλήθεια.
Είμαστε live, μην ξεχνάς, είμαστε live.
Ναι.
Τώρα.
Μας ακούνε όλοι.
Μας ακούνε όλοι.
Οκ.
Αλλά ναι, όντως. Yesterday, I got a message from a friend of Greek Ancestry. Said that, you know, he thanked Carol, Georgia, Alexandra, and me for organizing the conference. And he said, it feels so much better. I feel so less lonely now that, you know, I have a connection with Greece and Greek culture during these COVID times. So yeah, you are. The situation is.
It's a tough situation. It's a tough situation, but in the same time, webinars, technology, useful materials to connect people is very significant, is very critical at that point, because besides the impact in economy, in health of people, there is a mentality, the psychological aspect of all that has to do with loneliness, has to do with normal situation. Now we don't have a normal situation. So the psychological effects have to be very significant, have to be very important to people. And we have to take care of ourselves, to call our friends if we feel a little bit strange.
To organize a conference,
to read a book,
correct.
To go for a walk, even alone, but try to do something, not nothing.
You're right. You're right. I think we are ready to start the session. Let me introduce you. So, Giannis Michalakakos was born in Athens in 1985 to a Maniot family. He holds a BA in House Economy and Ecology from Karakopio University in Athens and a Master of Science in Cultural Management from the Hellenic Open University. He studies the history of Mani and Laconia and has published various articles. He is an active member of the Greek genealogical community and has participated in major initiatives. Ioannis also administrates Maniatica, which is a very, very interesting blog dedicated to Maniot history and genealogy. So the revolution ends in 1829, in 1830, and Greeks have a state. A new era begins for Greek history. Throughout the years, the country's expanded to include new territory. The state tries to create an educational system to stabilize and develop the economy, to create infrastructure. However, again, I feel we know too little about ordinary people's life in Greece, the life of those in the country's rural areas. So in this 45 minutes with Giannis, we would like you to draw a picture of life in 19th century Greek villages. And first of all, we would like to know about religion and the church. What was their role in people's life? What was the role of a priest?
Look, first of all, in order to understand the situation of Greeks and the average Greek family, because we have to stick in average Greek family, not in very rich, not in very poor, the average Greek family, in order to understand what was happening back there, to catch the feeling of the era, we have to divide the century before and after the Greek Revolution. The newborn state was a significant date around the 1830s, not only for Greece, but for all Europe. A new state in Eastern Mediterranean create a new status quo, a new balance in the area. We have a new player in the area. Even today, we can see the differences between the logic of the East and the logic of West. Greece is a new nation, a new state nation, because the nation was something that already was there, but we have a state nation like France after French Revolution, like United States after American Revolution, that we have after a revolution. So we create new opportunities there. So we have a new state that creates new balances in the area. However, as you said, we have old participants in the administration. The main participant is church. Christian Orthodox Church is something very important for the average Greek family. Why we say that? First of all, Greeks and most of the people of the Balkans had different religion from the Ottomans, from the main Ottoman population, from the main Ottoman Empire. Serbs, Bulgarians, some of the Albanians, Greeks are the majority of the population in Balkans, and we have an authority, the Ottoman authority, that for 300, 400, 500 years in some areas tries to create instability between this balance. The average Greek families had great difficulties, especially the first centuries of the Ottoman rule, about keeping their identity, the Christian Orthodox identity. However, after 1770s and in the start of 19th century, we see some privileges that were given to the people of Greece, and they could execute their ceremonies, their rituals with an easier way. However, in the start of the century, we have many obligations from the Greek Orthodox families towards the Ottoman Empire, to the Ottoman administration, because they were considered a millet. Millet was groups, national groups, ethnical groups that were divided as second-class population. There was the Armenian millet, the Jew millet for the Jewish people, the Greek millet for the Greeks. They were, with this way, the Ottoman Empire tried to had a better administration for solving problems between Christian Orthodox people, Jewish people. They didn't interfere in between differences. So they had a head, they had someone responsible for these differences or for matters that had to do with religion. I say again, we have to underline that religion, not only for Greeks, but also for the Ottoman Turks, had a great role. The difference in the national identity between a Greek and a Turkish, most of the times, we can't separate it from the identity of the religion. So religion had an important role, not only for the Greeks, also for the Ottomans. The head that was responsible, the responsible man who was responsible for the matters of Christian Orthodox Church was the Patriarch in Istanbul, in Constantinople. The Patriarch also was considered, even today is considered, part of the Ottoman administration. In fact, the Patriarch of Constantinople, of Istanbul, had the value of a pasha. I mean, it was like a head of a state that it was under the Ottoman role. When the Ottomans wanted something from the Greeks, they asked the head bishop, let's say the Patriarch. They didn't ask the local leaders or the local elders or the local. The Patriarch was important, was the important man, was the responsible man of how things of Greeks are going to be. For this reason, many times we had paybacks from Turks to Patriarchs when a revolution was started, because not only Greek Revolution of 1821 that happened in 19th century, but also other revolution who started had paybacks, revenge from Turks in Patriarchs, because they considered that plotted in that revolutions. But also we had to say that religion had a great role for the average, for the daily life, let's say, the daily life. Baptism, marriages were very important back then. And we have to say that it was part of a daily duty to go to the church or to have close relationship to the church. People were very much more spiritual than we are now today, because education was different, the way they were growing was different. Even after the Greek Revolution, church had a very important role in the state. There was a minister for the issues of church, and even now in Greece we have Minister of Education and Church. We have a minister, a political person who had the responsibility about that. Now we could say about the average priest, besides the great Patriarch, the average priest who was in every community, and we have to underline that there was not Greek community without a priest, a papa, as we call it, a papa. It was a very important role. It's not random that there is a proverb, as we say, in even today in the Greek villages, that the authorities of a village is the priest, the president, the doctor, the teacher, and the police officer. The police officer last. So you understand that the priest had an important role in the community, and most of all, his speech was important about what was going to happen in the community. In fact, the role of the priest was so important that many families that had an ancestor that was priest have even today nicknames or surnames that are created originally from the priest as a profession. Papadakos in Mani, Papadakis, very common in Crete, Papadopoulos in all Greece. It's the most common surname in all Greece. And of course, surnames that have to do with church, like Onomakis, Xepapadakos, the man who have abandoned the profession of priest, and you were pointed with the finger back then if you do something like that. The cloth was never had to be abandoned. So in Greek genealogy, it's very easy to understand if someone had a priest as an ancestor, if he had something like that as a name, Papa Nikolaou, Father Nikolaos, for example. We have something like that. Another thing that we can understand how important was the religion, and in fact how important was the impact of church is that many villages have names even today of saints, Saint George, Saint Nicholas, Saint Demetrios. It's very, very common for whoever comes in Greece to see names of saints in settlements, small or bigger.
Let's now dive even deeper, and let's.
I would like to show you a very nice, painting.
Okay.
Of around here we can see a priest, if you can see it. Here we can see a priest going to a house. Back then it was very common to do baptism in house around 1850s, 1870s in houses, and we see the whole family going to the house for the baptism, and kids transferring the kolibithra, the pot where the baby is going to be blessed in there. These were ceremony that was very common in houses because back then they were not easy. The financial degree was very low, and they were not easy to do big ceremonies like today.
Very interesting. I love this one. I'm okay. You can now stop sharing your screen. Let's talk about households. So tell us about what a Greek house looked like, what people ate, their music, their dance, the cotton industry.
In order to have, we have to understand that in the Ottoman Empire was not a central empire. I mean, the administration was not central like we have today in Greece, for example, a central prime minister with ministers and the administration above. United States looked like the administration. I mean, every governor in every province of the Ottoman Empire could push even further or lose the way of occupation. So in some places we see a different way of living, and in other places we have different way of living. Of course, we have to have in mind that in 19th century, where we are talking, we have a population growth of Greeks because the privileges that were given from the Ottoman Empire after the Revolution of Orlov eventually had an impact in economy, local economies, in villages, in settlements, so they could grow better and with better quality of living. However, we have places, most of them in plains, let's say, that where the administration was tougher, and places in mountainous villages that were away from the Ottoman eyes, and then from Bavarian eyes, and then from the official Greek eyes, that were better in the way of life, were a little bit out, they were in the edge of the law. So they could grow even industrial movements there, even industrial practices there. First of all, we have to see how was the average house, the average Greek house. Unfortunately, most of the travelers in Greece, the foreign travelers in Greece, they were describing the rich houses. Why? Because most of them were living in the houses of the rich people, of the elders, of the bishops, not in the average of the poor people. So we don't have many descriptions about the average people. However, we know very well, because even after the Ottoman rule, things didn't change a lot. The whole 19th century was a very difficult century for the average Greek household for many reasons, wars, conflicts, we will see next. There was a small house, mostly from stone or wooden, depending where this house was. Most of them were in mountainous villages, in differences with, there's a major difference with today. We have to understand that most of the people back then didn't live in Athens like today. Today, half of the Greeks live in Attica. Back then, the urban places, the urban cities, had the minority of the Greek population. So most of the people were scattered in the Greek province, and they had to live in a status of poverty. Most of the villages had houses that were with 2 rooms, 2 or 3 rooms. One of them was a common room. I mean, a room that were gathered around the fireplace, because most of them had fireplaces in the common room. And another one had, or 2, if they had, and girls to separate from the boys, or to have more luxurious life for some people, the bedrooms. Also, we have to understand that back then, the average Greek family didn't have 2 children like today. The average Greek family in 19th century started with many children in everyday life, and in progressing of the century, this was rising. So we find families with 10, 12 children in 1870s. If we see the election rolls, we can understand that they died early, but they had many people. Another reason that they had many children was that they needed them for agricultural matters as a personnel to help them. Back then, we didn't have tools, industrial tools to work, so many people tried to put their own children in work. Also, we have to understand that wars and insecurity was in everyday life. So children was a youth generally was a mean of survival, the family. I don't know if it is very clear of the average listener today, but back then insecurity was very high. People did a lot of children, had a lot of children in order to survive for security reasons and to survive the family. I can show you, let me show you a picture of inside a room. Let me show you, because I want to show you a lot of things today, but I don't know if we have the time.
Yeah, we still have 25 minutes.
Yes. Wait a minute. Unfortunately, I put it one by one in order to have we can see here, for example, here is the 1888, if you see, in Psara, the island of Psara, inside the house. As you can see, the decoration is limited. We don't have heavy decoration, if we can say that. Also, we can see that there is this is the common room. This is the room that the family is gathered. Here, this photograph, I chose this photograph for two reasons. One is to show you inside a room, inside the house, an average house. Of course, here we have Psara. Psara was a relatively rich island. Why? Because they had a fleet, a commercial fleet. But the other reason I chose to show you that, besides the decoration and, as you can see, the simplicity, here we have an epic simplicity inside the house. Here we have a funeral, a ritual of a funeral. We see the men beside, and in front of them, there are the women around things of a dead sailor. So we have to understand that in small communities, we have not only, in small communities, not only great small houses, but great bonds between the families. These bonds created, and the music, as we say. Here we have the folklore of death, the miroloi, as we say, a custom of a song that it is sung during a funeral. From the cousins, from the sisters, from the women of the dead. Generally, we can say that the average house back then was not rich. Imagine that in villages of Ikaria, a friend of mine who has origin from there told me once, the only thing someone could take from a house in Ikaria is a mile, the small stone mile that had to smash the wheat in order to create flour for the bread.
Yanni, can you tell us?
Can you, Gregory? Can you see now what I said?
You're not sharing your screen now.
Okay, give me a minute. I try, but the process is slow. Here we have a family living in a richer house. And here we have, as we can see, a servant. We have the elder sitting in a low seat, in a low chair. We can see the Ottoman impact in the Greek families. The table in the center of the center of the room is called sofras. It's a Turkish way of Turkish, Arabic, Middle East, let's say, to be closer to the reality. Furniture, kind of furniture. We see wood everywhere, so there is probably in northern Greece. And we see also very limited decoration, very limited of things that are not useful in everyday life. Generally, people didn't have things that were not useful in everyday life because they couldn't afford it. So average families had to live in small houses, most of, as we said, built from stone, and the roofs usually were from marble, plates of marble, and later, after 1850s, something that it was more, it was cheaper, ceramic roofs. So the houses were very simple. However, we have cases like Hydra, the island of Hydra, who was a very rich island because they had commercial fleet. So we have there many rich houses with many rooms, big rooms, many fireplaces, and this was a very a meter of wealth if you had many fireplaces back then in 19th century. For this reason, we say even today he comes from Jackie, from a fireplace means from a wealth family. And also we have places that had autonomy. So they created a different type of architecture, like here in Mani Peninsula, that yes, some people were staying in small houses, but others had a very big power politically and military. So they created castles, tower houses, towers, things that in the rest of Greece, only the very important Greeks could have. But these were not common. It was not the common true for all Greece. Most of the Greeks had small houses. The main, let's say, food of Greeks was the bread. The bread and production of the bread. I mean, they could create from wheat. Wheat was the most common production in Greece. Wheat, they smashed it, and they smashed it through windmills in the places where we had strong wind, or small mills, as we said, that used with the hand to smash a small amount of wheat in order to create flour for bread. The other thing that had very common, especially the shepherds, were the pies. But when we say pie in Greece, we speak about something small that usually is stuffed with cheese. Not something, not a meal that it is very strong, or a meal that it is very rich. The poor people had poor meals. So bread was simple to make, easy to make, and most of the Greek recipes back then were based in the bread and the productions like bread. Here we have a family that, if you can see, that creates in the oven. In most of neighborhoods had ovens that were not professional ovens. They were ovens that belonged to the families, and all the families of the neighborhood going there to have their bread ready. I think it's a very nice painting. As you can see, the bread is in the right corner of the painting. Usually, they didn't do it every day. They created big, round breads named karvelia in order to have it for 3-4 days for every family. It was not easy to be created every day, because this procedure was not something like today. We switch on the oven and something is ready in an hour, in half an hour, in 20 minutes. This was a procedure that needed an art. Right. Let's say an art. Good bread was an art.
So we have 12 minutes left. Can you tell us about occupations?
Occupations? What kind of occupations?
Of people. What people did.
Occupations. The occupations during we have to understand that lack of technology had different kind of occupations in the average family. The men had an important role, the main role. The women, as I'm going to see, had the secondary role, mostly in the household. But why men had the main role? Back then, most of the occupations had to do with power. Even simple occupations like military occupations, the priests, the politicians, the main occupations that had to do with power, considered for men. The other kind of occupations that were very common back then were the blacksmith, for example. Don't forget that silver was something very useful back then. Weapons, things for the house, things for the animals, the petals of the animals, because don't forget that the main transportation back then was the donkey in the Greek reality. Before the Greek Revolution, in fact, we have to say that the Ottomans forbidden to the Greeks to have horses, only donkeys. It was a characteristical type of show you that you are not worth to have a horse. So we see that even the roads, they didn't have roads. We have to understand that the situation back then in Greece was a chaotic situation. It has nothing to do with the other major cities of Europe. The average transportation was a donkey. They used silver very often. Of course, we have to say that the more the wealthier families used also silver for things inside the house, or not only for cans, for many things inside the house. Instead of wood or pottery. Also, we have to see the windmills. The very common occupation was the windmills. The people who were working there had the name Milonas. The name Milonas is a surname common even today in Greece. Why? Because this was a very common in every community. There was not a community without a Milona. Also, there was not any community without an elder, a political representative, even for the Mogeronta, even for the Greek state, even for the Ottomans before the Greek Revolution. So we have different kind of occupations. Of course, we have to underline here that geography had an important role for the occupation of every area. For example, the islands, especially the poor islands that had no water, like Santorini, Mykonos, Hydra had no water, created another way of economy that gave them too much money for the era. They created commercial fleets. The commercial fleets had to do trade with very expensive things that the Ottoman Empire had income from taxation, like tobacco, wheat, cotton. We understand even meat. They could put meat in salt and sell it in long distances. So we understand that depending the geography, for example, the mountainous villages, that most of them were farmers. However, these farmers, there were some people that had huge flocks that, depending the climate, they were moving the flocks from the mountains to the plains and from the plains to the mountains. Today, we see very often the word kalivia, meaning small, non-permanent places and settlements that these people, these shepherds, were living to sell and move their flocks. In other places, we have small industries. In places that were mountainous and difficult to be approached, however, we had small industrial centers. For example, in the Mitsana, we had gunpowder. They created gunpowder. In Vitina and Stemnica, they created jewelry. they knew how to use gold and silver and create jewelry. In Abelakia of Thessaly, we had a very good cooperation of people that sold until Holland. They could reach even Holland, Netherlands, to sell seats. They created seats with argallos, the machine that you can create clothing. So we see that there were occupations in places, but different kind of occupations. Even today, we have surnames of these occupations. For example, the man who puts the pedals in the horse, we call it petalotis. The man who cleans the silver things of a house, ganogis, and it is a surname today because their ancestor did this job. We can find very interesting things about genealogy in occupations of 19th century. And there are many, let's say, occupations that today are going to not exist for many years. For example, creating this, the samari, the cover of the donkey. Today it's not something that we find it as an occupation. Back then, it was very common. And for this reason, many people have even today the name Samaras. So we can find many interesting info about our name through the occupations back then. The women, in the other hand, who were back, their main task was to raise their children. However, in most cases, this task was far more complicated because in lack of technology, women had to do all the other things. I mean, not only to cook without a technological support, to wash the clothing, to create clothing, because some people didn't have the money to buy clothing. So they had to do other things to make the baby sleep. So we have the songs about sleeping babies, ton anourisma, as we call it. We have tasks of agriculture that women do mostly, like in Chios, as you saw previously. In Chios, they take out the masticha from the tree. Usually was a very female characteristic. In Mani, chasing quills, if I say a kind of bird, was a totally female job with nests. So you understand that a female had a more complicated role, especially in the islands and in the mainland, that people had to travel as merchants or people died during the wars. We have major problems because the woman had to deliver all the work and be the main character in the house. Even after the revolution, the same problem with the Greek family is that it is a patriarchic family throughout the century. We see that even in official documents of the state. It's rare to have a signature of a woman. It's rare to have many girls in education.
Right. So when a woman, like not during war, but in peacetime, when a woman became a widow, could she take up the family business? Like, could she become the miller or the ranomatis, whatever?
Yes, yes.
So women could actually.
We have cases. Of course, it depends the power of the woman. I mean, if she had a strong family around her that could support her and were respectful to the dead husband, could do many things. For example, we have the widow of a pirate named Sasaris that he had 3 ships, and after his death in 18th century, of course, not in 19th, but even that, even older, the woman was in charge of the fleet. But not only that, don't forget Mado Mavrogenus. She was daughter of a rich family, and she had her own fleet. The woman from Spetses, Bubulina. But these were exceptional personalities. It was not easy for a woman back then, especially uneducated, to have to be the main role. If the husband died, usually they had to accept the problem and create an agricultural future for the kids. I mean, farming was the main problem. And here we had also the support of the church sometimes.
Interesting. Yanni, we have to end the session.
I know.
I know you wanted to say so much more. Maybe in another webinar or on the next conference. Thank you so much. I think the information you provided us with is really relevant for everyone's family history research. So thank you.
Thank you, and I wish to everybody health. Let's say next year to be a better year, and I hope to everybody come in Greece that hear us and discover their past and have fun, healthy and with a good time.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Hey again.
Hi.
Well, rumor has it you have more exciting things to announce.
I do. We are going to have yet another giveaway. This time, the person who types village life in the chat, I'll pick at random. That person will get 3 free records from the Greek Ancestry collection. And I have to tell you that it is just phenomenal to see how the collections are growing on Greek Ancestry. 1 year ago, this weekend, was the launch of the Greek Ancestry.net website. Okay. Litsa Varonis is the winner of 3 free records from the Greek Ancestry website. Litsa, if you can contact Greg through the Greek Ancestry website, through the contact tab, or send him an email at greekancestry@outlook.com to claim your prize. Thank you so much. Greg, back to you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Hey, yeah, I can hear you. I assigned you over to the breakout room just barely, Georgia. So if you want to head over there, we can go meet with everybody.
Carol, do we have a winner for the giveaway?
We do. It's Litsa Varonis, Varonis.
Okay.
And she will be contacting you, Gregory, to claim her prize, 3 free records. Thanks.
Okay, are we ready to go?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Georgia Kyleman, and I'm going to be moderating this next session, Leaving the Homeland. I would like to introduce our panelists first before we get going. And I'm going to start with Professor Alexander Kitroeff. And he is currently a professor of history at Haverford College in Pennsylvania and has taught in several other institutions, including the Center for Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies at Queens College, CUNY, and the Onassis Center for Hellenic Studies in New York University, and the American College of Greece and college year in Athens. I don't know what that means, but okay.
College year in Athens is the study abroad, American students who study abroad.
Okay. His most recent books are The Greeks and the Making of Modern Egypt and The Greek Orthodoxy in America, A Modern History, which really pertains to what we're talking about today. Our next panelist is Professor Gonda von Steen. She earned a PhD degree in Classics and Hellenic Studies from Princeton University and holds the position of Cureus Chair in the Center of Hellenic Studies and the Department of Classics at King's College, London. She has written several books, and her latest book, Adoption, Memory, and Cold War Greece, Quid Pro Quo, is pertinent to our discussions today. Then I'm going to introduce our last panelist, which is Gregory Kontos, who's the star of our Greek Ancestry Conference. I don't think he needs any further introduction, okay? I'm going to start out with a question for Gregory. So Gregory, when and how did Greek migration to the US start? And where did they settle? And was there Greek migration to other countries in the same time period?
So we are aware of the economic Greek migration to the United States, which started in the 1880s and continued well into the 1920s. And we have Alexander here, who is the best person to talk to us about all that. But there was another migration current that started decades back in the 1840s. That migration was different to the one that followed, but it is interesting, and there are lots of things we can learn through its study. So that migration was centered around trade. We are talking about the time before the American Civil War, when cotton trade was at its highest. A company that belonged to the Rallis brothers from Chios and was based in London was engaged in this trade and opened its first American branch in New York in 1846. The company's branches in the US expanded in the following years. They opened offices in Boston, in St. Louis, in San Francisco, in New Orleans. Prominent Greeks, especially from Chios, were in charge of these branches. At the same time, these people would also take up consular posts representing the Greek state and securing Greek trade interests. So they and their families started settling more or less permanently in the United States. And this is the one group of Greek immigrants in the US in that period. The second group, the majority group, consisted of sailors, Greeks who came on board merchant vessels but decided to disembark and stay, again, more or less permanently in the States. After disembarking, these sailors would take up all sorts of occupations. Many became fishermen, others became artisans, fruit dealers. They opened little shops and cafes. And here's an excerpt from an 1873 newspaper article describing Greek coffee shops in New Orleans. Quote, "The American bar is combined with little oriental tables around which are seated Greeks talking all at the same time generally, all the idioms of the Grecian archipelago, drinking coffee and smoking paper cigarettes." Sounds familiar. So many became sailors again when we're traveling back and forth the Mississippi. In any case, the major port cities of the United States were the base of both groups, merchants and the rest. In the same time period, similar Greek colonies were formed in port cities in Europe, in London, in Liverpool, in Malta, in India, in Australia. Indeed, in 1869, according to an official report, there were about 500 Greeks, mostly men, in Australia, most of whom lived in Melbourne and Sydney. According to the same report, the first Greeks to settle in Australia came around 1800. That's about 30 years earlier than we knew so far. And the majority of these men, both in Australia and in the US, they tended to marry local women. And as there were no Greek schools, their children spoke English after a while. Now, what is really interesting is that stereotypes around Greek immigrants at that time period were generally positive. Americans would see them as something exotic, and most importantly, they would identify them as descendants and heirs of classical Greeks. That perception can be attributed to Romanticism and to its Greek expression, Philhellenism. And this positive impression led many Americans and Europeans to support Greek national causes. For instance, when the revolution of 1866 broke out in Crete, many relief committees were formed and supported the cause by making donations and propagating the rights of the revolutionaries. They took care of orphans and widows. They donated to the fleet. They published leaflets of support. However, positive stereotypes can also be attributed to the small number of Greek immigrants in that period for many reasons, which have to do with mobility, the timing of census taking, and many immigrants' fear of being registered. We are not able to know exactly how many Greeks there were in the US or in Australia. We are talking about a range scale of hundreds. As to how to trace a Greek immigrant of that period, US records are a prerequisite. Census records, city directories, naturalizations, ship manifests, all these are really helpful. However, the old records of the Orthodox churches in America can also be very valuable. For instance, vital records of the Orthodox Church in New Orleans, Holy Trinity, date back to the 1880s, and in one case, even earlier. And recently, Greek Ancestry and EMCA announced a joint project to digitize such church vital records collections for free. And we are open to proposals for that.
Okay. Alexander, why did the Greeks leave the homeland at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century? That's when we had our big migration from Greece. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can talk about it, Georgia, yes, and I have a couple of slides I'd like to share as well. Sure. I'm going to share my screen and bring the slides up, and these are the questions I wanted to address. And
okay.
This is the mass migration. So Gregory spoke about the 19th century, which is a varied migration of different peoples, of merchants, of mostly wealthier persons, but also some early Peloponnesians. And this is what I'm talking about, is what we call mass migration, which begins in the 1890s and ends in the 1920s. With over 400,000 persons who are either Greeks, or when we say Greek race, they're of Greek origin, but they're from the Ottoman Empire, so they haven't got Greek papers. 400 of them come over. By 1900, 25,000 had entered. And the peak years are 1907 and 1914 with 46 and 45,000 people. That is a lot of people leaving Greece. And the extraordinary thing is that they leave the port of Patra that you see here in the slide, but there's also other smaller ports in Peloponnesus where by 1912 you could get a boat from there and go over to the United States. I'm talking about Yithio in Laconia and Katakolo in Ilia. If you visit those places now, I mean, they're beautiful, but they basically have big kaikia and maybe some yachts. The idea that you could get a ship from Yithio to come to the US is really quite striking. The reasons they emigrated, I think we've got to look at many reasons. That's why I call them a bit of a domino effect. I mean, the main reason, the trigger, the first domino, if you like, is the currant crisis. The currants are the dried grapes that were the main export. And there's a crisis in Peloponnesus in the currant cultivating areas, and people leave to address their economic issues. And other people from other regions of Greece and islands see the opportunities, see the fact that people are emigrating, and they follow. So it's the current producing areas of Peloponnesus and southern Greece, but then it spreads to the rest of the Greek-speaking areas. And then, part of the dominoes is that, you've got shipping agents and ships that actually promote this. They put advertisements in newspapers telling you how easy it is to get to the United States. And therefore that encourages the migration as well. But really the main issue is the first domino, as I said, are the Corinthian currents. And there's an extraordinary little story here because the French grape production gets affected by a blight, phylloxera, in the 1880s, which means the French are not exporting, and therefore the Greeks are the second biggest exporter. And this is the time when currants are very popular in Britain because they are a staple for these British desserts. As you can see here, I've got this photograph of what is called a traditional spotted dick, quintessential British dessert, which relies on currants. So Greece is 60% of Greek exports by the 1880s and 1890s are currants because there is such high demand in Britain. Then the French vines recover by the 1890s. They take over the exports, leaving the Greeks in the lurch. And all those Greeks who had focused on vine production and cultivation are now unable to export, so they emigrate. But the reason that they will emigrate to the United States is not just economic, but social, because what is happening, part of the economic crisis in Peloponnesus has to do with the fact that families with daughters are still holding out for, families with daughters still have to produce dowries for their daughters to be married, because families with sons, now that they haven't got any other economic means, are holding out for the type of dowries that existed during the good old days of the current exports of the 1880s and 1890s. As we know, the family is the main unit for the Greeks. So the families with daughters make this decision to send the oldest boy, the oldest son, over to the United States to bring back money for the family so that the daughter can have the proper type of wedding with a proper type of dowry. This is a beautiful photograph. This is not from Peloponnesus. It's from Karpathos, the island of Olympos, but it just shows us the significance of dowries. So in a sense, migration was related to economics, but also family needs. And, you know, the early migrants are all men. So everyone says, oh, it's just men going over to make money. No, it's sons of families going over to make money for their families, because we're talking about Greece, where the family is so important. And they send back the remittances, they get their sisters married, and there's also evidence of an improvement in the area. There's no usurious lending rates anymore. People don't have to gauge in high interest to borrow money. Living standards are raised, and new houses are built. And those new houses, of course, because that's money from America, are called the Americanica houses.
Very interesting.
I've got a couple more slides about the integration of the immigrants and identity, but I don't know if we want to talk about other things now.
No, you can show those if you want. We will ask you more questions later, but go ahead, you can show them.
Okay. Good.
We're pretty loose here.
That's great. You know, when the Greeks arrive in the United States, there are two competing visions of America. There's America as a melting pot, and Israel Zangwill is a playwright. In 1911, 1912, he's part of the people who think that America should be welcoming immigrants. But there is another vision of America, which is hostile, xenophobic towards the immigrants of Southeastern Europe. And there's the Greeks face a lot of xenophobia and racism, and there's many of these announcements in newspapers. No Greeks need apply because they are not considered to be the right type of people that the older Americans want to employ. So this is a period that begins in around 1910 onwards and goes through the 1920s. And the Greek response to this is to adapt. If anything, the Greek migrant, the Greek member of the diaspora, if anything, is adaptable to the circumstances. So there is spontaneous responses and organized responses. On the left, this is a picture of Aristodimos Kaldis, who is one of the best-known Greek-American artists of the 20th century. And I was interviewing his son, actually, just a few days ago, and he gave me a beautiful story. He said that Aristodimos, arrived in 1917, settled in Newport, Rhode Island, and one of the first things that the Greeks there did was to learn Irish songs. And I said, yes, what? And the thing is, they went out to the bars late and emerged from them in an inebriated state. And the Rhode Island and the Northeast was policed by Irish policemen. So as soon as they saw an Irish policeman, these inebriated Greek immigrants broke out into wonderfully rendered Irish songs and stayed safe. It's a story.
It's a great story.
It's a great story, but it speaks to the adaptability of the Greeks. I mean, they learned the Irish songs so well. The other, of course, big story is AHEPA. I think everyone who's following this conference knows about AHEPA, established in 1922 to organize the Americanization and the adoption of American citizenship and the adoption of the English language by Greek immigrants. Hugely successful, hugely effective. This is one of the many articles that appear in the 1920s. Its members, including leading Greek residents of this section, are pledged to become better citizens through education and general enlightenment. the Greeks have chosen this as their land of adoption, etc. AHEPA is very, very effective in actually protecting not only its members, but Greeks and Greek immigrants. And on the left, you see here that the year after AHEPA was established, there were 2,920 Greeks who acquired US citizenship. And by 1927, they were 9,518. And this is all AHEPA pushing the Greeks to take citizenship. And during, until the eve of World War II, you've got almost 65,000 Greeks adopting citizenship. My other slide is just a reminder to everyone. We talk about AHEPA as a force of assimilation and integration, but it did also foster ties with Greece. And this is the front page of the Vradini newspaper of Athens. This is the first of the annual excursions AHEPA does to Greece. And it's front page news for all the newspapers. They're welcomed by the government. There's a lot of events in Athens. And then there are several days left for the members of AHEPA. And of course, what do? They go back to their villages in Peloponnesos and elsewhere. And this is an example of how AHEPA and how Greeks, I think, both integrate, adapt, but also maintain the ties to the homeland. And my final couple of 2-3 slides have to do with what I just said, the way that they adapt on the one hand, but they preserve their national identity. And I think when we talk about Greek identity, I think it's really language, religion, and place of origin. That's why I'm a great admirer of everyone involved in this Ancestry project, because I think place of origin, historically, I see as very important element of Greek identity. But it's really the church which is the main agency of Greek identity in the United States. And that happens because in 1931, newly appointed Archbishop Athinagoras, who will eventually become ecumenical patriarch, calls for the local parishes to replace the local Greek community organizations. Earlier, the community organization ran the church. Athinagoras comes along and says there's too much politics, there's too much Venizelist royalists, there's too much personal stuff. We don't want the parish beholden to the community. We want the parish to be the main body locally in American towns and administer the schools, administer the philanthropic organizations through the Ladies Philoptochos, etc. So the church, in a sense, with Athinagoras, takes over the responsibility of fostering Greek identity. So Greek identity is very much tied up with religion because of the hugely important role that the church plays. I think Greek Orthodox churches also foster, I'm concluding here, foster a third element of identity, attachment to the place of origin. The slide on the left is from St. Sophia in Los Angeles, which is one of the most impressive Greek Orthodox churches in America. But I think the building of Greek Orthodox churches, especially those who have Byzantine style architecture, but whatever the outside architecture, the inside of a Greek church in America, I think, and the liturgy reminds Greek immigrants of home, of place, of village, of the church locally. And I think it's a very, very important connection that they have. I think they come into the church and they somehow have a sense that a connection with Greece. Of course, the other big organizations that foster local identity are the ubiquitous topika somatia, as they're called, local societies. I've got a couple of slides here. The Pontian Society, established in 1939 in Philadelphia, and the Kassos, the small island of Kassos, has its own society founded in 1929 in the Bronx. I'm always asked about the future. My mentor, Professor Briones, always used to say, when they asked him, "You're asking the wrong person. I'm a historian. I know about the past, not the future." So with that proviso, if I were to ask about the future of Greek identity, I think language will inevitably erode, but I think religion and a sense of heritage, which includes genealogy, will stay very, very strong and robust. And I think Greek identity will survive thanks to those elements.
Well, we do see a huge increase in people that are interested in their Greek heritage. And I think that has to do with what generation we're in. My immigrant were my grandparents. So that was the early 1900s. So now we don't have them anymore. We don't have any reference to it. So we're all reaching out to try to identify with that. Okay, Gonda.
Thank you.
When I'm fascinated by this subject, okay, but when did children from Greece start being adopted by families in America, and why did the families put these children up for adoption? And how many children were adopted in that period?
Thank you. I'm hoping to answer all these questions, the when, the what, the why, and the how, equally important. But I'd first like to say a big thank you that this topic of the adoptions can be part of a Greek ancestry conference. And a special thank you to you, Georgia, because you know that the questions of the Greek adoptees have been coming fast and furiously to the Hellenic genealogy gig. So there is some sort of a movement brewing. And if I may build on Gregory's wonderful presentation and Alexander, Gregory who qualified an early migration, Alexander who qualified a mass migration, I may actually characterize this one as a silenced migration, a silent migration, occasionally even silenced migration, but no longer silent because these people are speaking for themselves and issuing their own books as adoptees. And I'm showing just two that came out in 2019. This one, Beyond the Third Door, by an American adoptee. This one, The Foundling of Crete, by a Greek adoptee who grew up in the Netherlands, 400 pages in Dutch. So clearly people have a lot to say about this. And I welcome this movement because I'm only the researcher who would love to take backstage if it wasn't clearly that this topic required some attention. And let me now turn to my fact sheet so I can walk through the questions that Georgia put out for us. And here goes. I hope you can all see it.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So a few facts then. When? Well, this adoption movement from Greece to the US should be situated between 1948 and all through the 1960s. And from Greece to the US, we see more than 3,000 children travel. And that is a conservative estimate. There are more. And then in addition to those several thousands of children going to the US, there are another 600 Greek children who go to the Netherlands. And they're probably the most forgotten of all, also because they operate in their own language, which is Dutch, and don't immediately tap into the Greek-American movement concerning these adoptions. Now, these children go to the US, and I'm going to focus mainly on the US, in waves. And it's important to kind of distinguish various waves. In a first wave, they are war orphans, orphana polemu, right? And of course, very many are born during the Civil War, have lost parents during the Civil War, or cannot be absorbed by exhausted families of the early 50s. And sure enough, through some sort of an Greek-American, AHEPA-led charitable movement, these war orphans find homes and adoptions in the US, very often with distant family members. So very often these people then are indeed orphans, have memories of the war, have nowhere to go to in Greece, and are absorbed into Greek American families, but with full knowledge of their roots. They know exactly what happened to them. Many of them are already teenagers. That movement shifts very, very quickly. By the mid-50s, we're looking at a totally different adoption movement. And by now, by 1955, we see a lot of illegitimate children go from Greece to the US. These are the children born to typically very young mothers who are not married. And given that there is limited access to abortion, a tremendous sense of shame on the and not exactly an economic opportunity for single mothers to make a life on their own with their child. These children end up in orphanages, but orphanages for very young children, which in Greek we call vrephokomia. Very often they are foundlings. Very often they are anonymously delivered to the vrephokomia. And here is where it gets problematic for these people's ancestry search, because they are, and they drop from the moon, as it were. They come without any identifying markers, without any paperwork, very often without a fixed date of birth. So the illegitimate babies then form the main component of the second wave of this adoption movement from Greece to the US, which in the US is facilitated by the 1953 Refugee Relief Act, which as an act doesn't exactly respond to Greece. It responds rather to the Americans' desire to do something for orphans all over the world. But dare I say, and we have to speak clear language here, the American preference is for white orphans. And they're still called orphans, even though most of them are not. But you can see how something of that previous language of the war orphans still sticks to these children, which I would much rather prefer to call adoptees. So these institutions then become main sourcing grounds, if I may call them, to send babies, because by now the children are younger, babies on their way to the US. And one of the main leading institutions is the vrephokomia of Patras. In second order comes the vrephokomia of Athens, a little bit from the Ayostilianos foundling home in Thessaloniki, and then later in the 50s also from the Kendro Vrefon, the baby center of Mitera. So you can see that there are various sourcing grounds here that keep a constant stream of adoptees going to the US. Occasionally, but far less often, we see that the contact is directly made between a lawyer and family interested in adopting and, let's say, a widowed mother. That happens far less. And those circumstances are particularly tragic because you immediately realize that no widowed mother would want to give up a child if it wasn't that she was in dire need. So we move then from older children who had roots and have memories and are therefore meeting less difficulties when searching, to babies, often foundlings. And then we need to remind ourselves of the American laws that organize this all and that allow Americans to adopt up to 2 children at the same time, and sometimes even up to 3 or 4, if they are willing to keep a sibling group together. That would be the criteria, which in itself is, of course, a good thing, so that not everything is uprooting, that there is at least the sibling togetherness. Now, the question then is, who are the intermediaries? The AHEPA is in the lead, especially in the beginning, with that movement of the war orphans. And then by the mid-50s, unfortunately, the AHEPA is again in the lead in this movement kind of souring, and I have to say it, becoming quite lucrative for a few of the AHEPA presidents, in particular Skopas, who then becomes the first subject of a big scandal of 1959. So it's particularly tragic in a way that something that started out with the best intentions deteriorates so quickly, and that the AHEPA is then seen to compete with other institutions and agencies such as the International Social Service, PICPA, which is the Greek Welfare Service, and other private lawyers. So by the mid-50s, instead of trying to place orphans in good homes, we see these various intermediaries compete for children, which are now in shorter supply, compete for children to make sure that families in America get a child. So now the dynamics have very quickly shifted from the demand, the American demand outstripping the supply. And I put this in rather crude, dare I say, economic terms, but that's ultimately what it amounted to. And Greece is identified, sadly so, as the supply of young white children. A supply that occasionally is, dare I say, oversupplied by cutting a few corners. So here is in the late 50s where irregularities come in. And these scandals then of 1959 in New York and in 1962 in Thessaloniki cannot surprise us, obviously. It's also the scandals and the legal action that eventually put a stop to this mass stream of adoptions to America and actually kind of diverted the stream to the Netherlands and then eventually made adoption in Greece focus much more on domestic adoption, children staying in Greece. So then it is indeed somewhat painful that it was very easy for Americans to adopt a child. Financial criteria is what make the cut. People put in their application, they are not very heavily screened. As long as they can prove that they meet the financial criteria, that is unfortunately good enough. You can kind of see that I'm very much aware of the fact that adoption is not a fairy tale story for a whole lot of people. There's a lot of unmet expectations and a lot of unpreparedness and a lot of trauma actually involved. And I'm very...
on both sides.
On all sides. And I don't want to cast blame on the prospective parents who weren't very prepared, or on the agencies who were trying to do the right thing. I do want to cast some blame on people who were acting as intermediaries for whom making money was more important than screening the parents carefully. All right then, what is sad is that there is very poor record keeping attached to these adoptions. So that means that the adoptees to this day have quite a set of hurdles ahead of them to penetrate the various institutions, the various laws, the various documents, and kind of distill what that all means. And a little bit of Greek government help would be wonderful here, because to this day, we've never seen a full-blown Greek investigation or a full-blown register of these adoptions, and we have a lot more of awareness raising to do as well.
Well, can I ask a question here? I hear, on Hellenic Genealogy Geek, that some people will report that their parents didn't actually give them up, but the parent was told that the child died and that the person was sent and that the child was sent overseas. Did that happen quite often?
It happened, but not as often as we occasionally claim. I want to emphasize that irregularities happened, but they're not the majority of cases. And I hasten to say that because very often this history has been cast in, stolen children and, boatloads full of children. And that is not the case. When we drill down to it, we very often find a mother agreeing to the adoption. But I want to then ask the question, did she have any alternative? And very often there's a lot of family pressure, because an illegitimate child, as strongly knit as the Greek family is and remained, there is really not much room for the illegitimate child. So very often, a lot of family pressure and economic pressure comes to bear on young mothers who are told that this is the best option for their child. So the large majority of cases are indeed of children who were legally relinquished, and there is a court document to go with that, but it's very difficult for us to kind of unpeel the levels of coercion or despair that went into this.
Okay, well, we're going to come back to you. let's go back to the migration question a second. Gregory, what role did the church play in the early years of Greek migration in the US and other countries? There was no Greek church involved in that, was there?
So religion mattered a lot to those early immigrants. And my opinion is that it was equally or sometimes even more important than national identity. And this is what I call religio-national symbiosis. In mid-19th century, national identities were a relatively new thing, fresh thing. They were still being constructed and spread, while religious identity, on the other hand, and the church had a tradition of millennia. Before nationalism came in the 18th and 19th century, religion was people's primary identification. In the Ottoman Empire, all Orthodox Christians, the Rooms, belonged to one single religious community, regardless of their ethnicity. There were Orthodox people who spoke Greek, Bulgarian, Albanian, Turkish, Arabic, and they all belonged to the same community. They had common churches, and the head of all was the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople. Those people who left in the 1840s and the 1850s, 60s, not only from the Greek kingdom, but also from predominantly Orthodox areas of the Ottoman Empire, such as Chios, brought this understanding with them in the lands of their immigration. This becomes very clear in the case of New Orleans, the home of the oldest Greek Orthodox Church on American soil. In New Orleans, Greeks worked together with Slavs for the foundation of a church, Holy Trinity. This was not because of their small number or a lack of funds. Greeks outnumbered Orthodox Slavs and had sufficient resources to found a church of their own. Cooperation should be, I believe, attributed to the special understanding of belonging to a religious community which transcends national and ethnic lines. The perspective of diplomats or national state-controlled churches was really different. They saw a nationalist dimension in any multi-ethnic cooperation. Their fear was that the other party, be it the Greeks or the Slavs, would take over this or that community. However, sources indicate that ordinary people did not share such concerns. What mattered to them was to have an Orthodox church, to baptize their children, to commemorate their dead. Their religious community did not see nationalist distinctions. For this reason, Holy Trinity Church in New Orleans is decorated with Greek and Russian icons. It has gospels in Greek and Slavic, and it has a long tradition of a multi-ethnic mass, which also includes Arabs. Actually, according to Holy Trinity's old sacramental journals, which have been preserved, digitized, and recently indexed, from 1891 to 1896, about 40% of the baptized children were Greek, 36% were Arab, and 24% were of Slavic origin. Those immigrants' bond was their faith. Their faith was so strong that they managed to found a church in the New World, something that had previously failed in New York, for example. They managed to find priests, even if complex arrangements had to be made overseas, and the priests had to travel from Syros, Athens, Constantinople. People who did not live in New Orleans, but lived in Mississippi, in Alabama, in St. Louis, or even in New York, they would travel to New Orleans with their children to baptize them.
Wow.
Or alternately, the Holy Trinity priests would travel to distant places such as Chicago to conduct baptisms and marriages. But this is a religio-national symbiosis. So none of these suggest that religion and the church was those people's only identification and interest. The same people formed relief committees when revolution broke out in Crete in 1866. For example, Konstantinos Kililis, who was one of the founders of the Holy Trinity Church in New Orleans, in 1867, he was already gone from Greece for a whole 30 years. But still, he did not forget, quote, his sublime duty towards the homeland. And he donated 500 drachmas to the Committee for the Cretan People and another 500 to the Committee for the Formation of a National Fleet. And the same people were trying to convince their American friends to support Greek causes. Some of them were subscribers to newspapers in Greece, and others borrowed Greek newspapers to read if they couldn't afford it. So we are talking really about a balance between religious and national identity, which we do not really see later, and which has been, I think, misunderstood so far.
Okay, that's interesting. Alexander, I find this next question to be very interesting because I've experienced a little bit of it in history. I've seen it. When you had new immigrants coming into the country, but there were older immigrants here already, what was their attitude about the new immigrants?
Okay, so as we know, Gregory spoke about the 19th, and I spoke about the
right.
And then there is a third wave, aside from that, the wave that Gonda put so delicately. There is there are people who come in as displaced persons in the 1950s, and then 1965, the immigration laws open up again, and we have about 75,000 Greeks who come from the mid-60s through 1974, and this is Astoria, for instance. And there are big differences. There are big differences. Nikon Patrinakos, one of the Greek Orthodox theologians at the time, has written about how the Greek Greeks thought that the older immigrants were Amerikanakia in a sense. Ironically, of course, now their children
are also, yes,
the same thing. But then there was a difficult symbiosis, and the Greeks from Greece went to the local fraternities, the Topika Somatia. They did not go to Ahepa, who they thought was completely Americanized and a waste of time. And they went and organized their own Greek clubs. And this was the reason why there was this awful clash in 1970 when Archbishop Iakovos said that priests could, it was up to the judgment of the local priest whether the liturgy would take place in English or not, depending on the knowledge of the congregation. And there was a big backlash against Archbishop Iakovos, and this was the new Greeks who had the Greek language newspapers and clubs in the 1970s in New York City. So it took a while. I think there's always that difference.
Well, you know, I grew up, I was born in 1950. I'm giving away my age here, but when this wave of immigrants came in the 60s, okay, my parents were born in the US. It was my grandparents that had come here, but still considered themselves very Greek. They were Greek. When these new immigrants came in, they were like too Greek. Okay, they you know, and there was this clash. They didn't fit in. These two groups did not fit together at all. It wasn't what the people from Greece thought. It was what the ones that were here in the US thought. They were like, wait a minute, you're like too Greek. We don't, you know, they didn't fit into the way they were used to living.
Yes, both sides.
Yes.
It took a while.
Yeah, it sure did. And like you said, as time went on, their children became the Greeks that were Americanized. And, you know, it's very interesting to see. That happens in every nationality, though, I'm sure.
I think what we have in the 1970s, which brings the two Greeks, the two generations together, is the revival of ethnicity, the legitimization of of ethnicity, of heritage. This is when Nicholas Gage writes in the New York Times, "It is chic to be Greek." He writes that in 1975. And somehow the older generation, who were so busy assimilating and integrating, suddenly realize, hey, it's okay to be, it's chic to be Greek, and they become more reconciled with their Greek identity, and that, I think, brings them closer to the, let me call them the Astoria Greeks.
Well, it's interesting because my nieces and nephews who are now in their 20s and 30s, they're very proud to be Greek. They are so into being Greek, you know, where when we grew up, we weren't. We were, you know, I never had a Greek in my school, you know, so. All right, let's, I want to ask Gonda about, were Greek adoptees embraced by the Greek communities in the US? How were they adopted by mostly Greek parents, or were they adopted by other ethnic groups, and were they embraced by the Greek community here?
I'm going to start with your second question first. Were they adopted by Greek Americans? That's the minority of cases. The large majority is everything else. And when I say everything else, I mean everything else. So any American citizen, and you have to be only one American citizen in a couple, any American citizen who was married, perhaps to another citizen, perhaps not, could apply for a Greek child. So that means that the majority of Greek children end up in any conceivable American family. They have two characteristics, and the characteristics are not ethnicity or Greek ancestry. The characteristics are a certain amount of financial resources to make this possible, and white. This is still very much America of the 1950s, where white couples get priority in adopting white children, which is also one of the reasons why Greek children were so in demand, because they're white, and the adoptions are fairly easy. Now, the children that ended up with, let's say, Baptist Americans in the South, I'm thinking of Texas, where a lot of them went to, don't necessarily have contact with any Greek community, or don't have a good definition of what Greek ancestry is. Their closest contact is their annual attendance at the Greek festival. That's the extent of it, and the occasional Americanized Greek food. On the contrary, then, the children that grew up with Greek Americans, perhaps in clusters in Chicago, had contact with the Greek community, were accepted by the Greek community, welcomed by the Greek community, have an extended network of homogeneia, churches, summer camps, festivals that they organize and volunteer in. So it very much depended on the family that took you in. And that is then also the defining factor of whether you kept up the language, the religion, the travel to Greece, the curiosity about Greece, all of it. It comes as a package. But for the large majority of adoptees, the Greek connection has been lost for 50 years and is actually only being rediscovered now, because it's in the 60s, in people's 60s and approaching 70 years old that they're asking questions. It took a COVID lockdown for people to have a little more time on their hands and massively turn to genealogy. It took the voices of a few adoptees to kind of spur the others into searching. And so the questions that have always kind of been on the back burner are now coming out in full force. Now that also more online tools are available and more interlocutors, but also now that the big medical questions are coming up in your 60s, right? Especially in an era when we're all reminded of our vulnerability. A lot of our vulnerability, biological vulnerability, is genetically defined. So that question that was always, where do I come from? And have really nothing to go on, becomes now a question of, let me see what I have. Can I read something about that? Can I talk to people? Can I post my quest on the Hellenic Genealogy Geek? And before you know it, this movement has just really kind of gone in a whirlwind.
Yes, I think when they see other people have success in finding their birth parents, they realize it can be done if those parents are still alive. I think a lot of them too, I might be wrong, this is happening at this age because their adoptive parents have passed away and they don't have to worry about that anymore.
Exactly.
And they
Exactly.
can look now with, you know, a clear conscience that they can try to find what's going on.
Yeah, it's a little sad when some would see a certain kind of, that searching would somehow interfere with the loyalty to adoptive parents, but searching is an answer to where do I come from and what does that background entail. It has nothing to do with loyalty to adoptive parents, but that's not necessarily how people perceive it. But definitely the fact that they're entering their 60s in an era of crisis and vulnerability has really shaken something loose. And along with the question of searching for their ancestry comes the hope, the ideal, the idealization of recovering Greek citizenship. And do we have a lot to say about that? And include, so here is what I want to do to the people who actually have a say in this matter at Greek consulates. I want to emphasize that this Greek adoptee movement is now 70 years old. They are the oldest mass post-war adoption movement from one country to another. It's also the least known. It's very unknown in Greece, and it needs to be, what is done, but a certain form of redress can still take place. These children traveled with a Greek passport, with a degree very often from the court in Athens, if not Thessaloniki or Iraklio. And these people now, the burden is on them to prove that they're somehow Greek, which is incredibly hard to do if you are a foundling. But they were Greek enough to be sent on their way in the 1950s. These people should be first in line with their requests for Greek citizenship. And ideally, it shouldn't be everybody's fight individually. Ideally, it would be a very nice gesture of any Greek government that wants to take it on, to just hold out an open hand to these people who are so eager to come back, restore them to dual citizenship if that's what they want. It wasn't through any fault of their own that they were set on the plane, let alone lost their citizenship. So if Greece could extend a hand to these people and massively facilitate their access, I'm going to go on to records and citizenship, that would be a dream come true, and it would do a lot for that unsilencing of the silent migration. On that note, I stop there, but not without expressing my help to make that happen.
Okay. And we are going to stop here for today.
Well said, Gonda. So,
thank you. I know I have you on board because you're writing the history of the AHEPA, and something will trickle through there. I've been on your case about that.
Oh, can't wait to read that book. Okay. All right. We'd like to encourage all of our viewers to subscribe to the Greek Ancestry YouTube channel and follow Greek Ancestry on Instagram. And you can get handouts. All the handouts that we have are available on the website, on the conference tab on greekancestry.net. So don't forget that those are there. Now, please join us tomorrow. We have a lot going on tomorrow. And it's basically in 3 different sections: Greeks on and across the border, new research methodologies, and Greek genealogy. What's next? It'll be a very exciting and busy day. So please join us. And thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Alexander and Gregory, for being on this panel today. It was very interesting. Thank you very much. We didn't go too much over, so Gregory won't yell at me. Okay.
Thank you for making this possible. I really appreciate it.
It was nice meeting you both. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.